Paul has chosen not to include. That is how, being an academic, I start my classes also. Old habits die hard, you know.
Is my audio okay now? Better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it is better now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So I think we'll kickstart. So I just start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Of course, we're still building up. We're hoping that more people will join us. But this session is recorded as well, so we're hoping to make it available for further viewing, and of course, we'll be able to rewatch it and craft some of the conversation that's going to happen here today. So this is the Global Economic Ideas Festival, which is put together by the ICC, the institution that I work for, of course, with Dr. Pankaj as well, which is the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. So the ICC is a professional body that is providing certification in economics. So really we're raising and training economists, people that are already working as economists, but need regular updates in terms of continuous professional development, as well as people that are aspiring to work as an economist, or individuals that, based on your current role or your future role, it requires that you have some knowledge in economics, that you usually have macro, micro, and all these conversations. Then, of course, we recommend the ICC to you as a qualification that you might be interested in taking. We operate just like other professional bodies that are in the field of accounting, in finance, in marketing, and what have you. So we are in the field of economics. So typically, we open to membership. Of course, people enroll in our qualification program, and they go through a series of curriculum that we have to, at the end of the day, they are awarded as a chartered economist from the ICCE. Apart from that, we also try to, engage our learners and our members, and of course, global community through a series of platforms like the GEIF that we have. For the first time, we have in the Global Economic Ideas Festival. So we try to create such platforms to ensure that we can have meaningful conversations. As economists, we have to be part of the conversation that will create the kind of world that we all desire to have or live in. So that is why a platform like the GEIF is very important to us. It's the annual global conference that we hosted by the ICCE. We are typically more focused on emerging markets, more so, of course, but we want to have a global presence. Just like we've witnessed in our first edition, we are very fortunate to have confirmed, of course, working with multiple speakers across across the world, across various continents, who have agreed to share perspective and insight with that, just like we have here today. So this is our last session for day one. It will continue again from day two is tomorrow, which we have 3 sessions today. We have 5 sessions. This is our last session for today, and we're very excited that we have the chance to get into yet another important conversation happening around the world, and what a better way to also make our voices make a contribution. Of course, even after this conversation, the kind of notes and the kind of communication that will be coming out of this, we think will go a long way to support the already conversation happening in the climate change and all of that. So we're very much excited to begin this session, which will happen, I think, give or take under 1 hour. So we're very excited to start. And to do this, we have our very own Dr. Pankaj Agarwal, who is part of the International Board of Standards of the ICC, a professor of finance and economics at IIM, in one of India's leading business schools. So Dr. Pankaj, please, I will hand over to you now, so you can take us through the next 45, 50, 1 hour. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and a very warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are right now. So thank you, Paul, for telling us about ICCE, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with 2 very, very esteemed guests. So I believe that all the audience are aware that the topic for this panel is climate finance and emerging market economies in the new era of energy transitions. So although this is the last panel, but I assure you last will not be the least, and we are in for some very exciting conversation with two very esteemed panelists. And I have the honor of welcoming the panelists, Ms. Smita and Mr. Ani. So welcome Smita and Ani to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I also would like to have the privilege of introducing both of our panelists. So I'll start off with Smita. Smita is a Vice President, Sustainable Finance and ESG at Optus ESG Limited Liability Partnership India. She is a finance professional with over 15 years of corporate and entrepreneurial experience. She has an MBA in finance and she has worked across sustainable finance, ESG, impact investing, business strategy. It's a long list. Investment banking in organizations like ING, EY, Marsh and McLennan, Spark Capital, and IndusInd Bank. She's also donned the entrepreneurial hat in her career, handling assignments on go-to-market strategies and worked on research papers relating to impact investing, private equity, and venture capital funding. So at Optus, Smita takes care of project implementation, design and development of financial products, stakeholder management, and business development across sustainable finance, ESG, and climate strategy. So welcome to the panel, Smita.
Thank you.
And now I will have the privilege of introducing Ani. So Ani is the president and CEO of World Resources Institute. So actually Ani is a short name. Aniruddha Dasgupta is the president and CEO of WRI, where he works to advance the Institute's global vision to improve the lives of all people and ensure that nature can thrive. Dasgupta is a widely recognized leader in the areas of sustainable cities, urban design, poverty alleviation. He developed his expertise in positions ranging from non-profits in India to the World Bank, where he developed bank's first knowledge strategy. And prior to joining WRI in 2014, Dasgupta served as a director of knowledge and learning at the World Bank, where he provided leadership in the bank's knowledge services for development. Dasgupta holds a master's degree from MIT in city planning and architecture. So welcome to the panel, Ani.
Thank you very much.
So I think now we can start with the first questions. So I think first things first, and I would like to take this opportunity to ask Smita to respond to the first question. So the topic of the panel is on climate finance. And Smita, we hear synonymous terms: climate finance, green finance, sustainable finance. So for the benefit of our audience, can you briefly describe whether they are similar or there is some nuance which differentiates them? Over to you, Smita.
Thanks, Pankaj. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. So to come to your question, you're right. There are different definitions and different agencies and institutions have kind of broadly under the term of sustainability, but more looking at how these definitions can serve their underlying objectives and motivations. So sustainable finance is basically an overarching term which looks at finance towards sustainable activities, within which sits green finance, which is financing green endeavors, and then within that sits the climate finance, right? So there is an overarching agreement between stakeholders that this is what these terms mean, but there is no single definition. Now, climate finance itself encompasses all investments that support climate actions, which include mitigation and adaptation efforts, right? So actions to achieve net zero carbon emissions or a net zero economy falls broadly under the mitigation measures. So globally, mitigation finance takes a major share of climate finance, about 90% or so. And so sectors like renewable energy, EVs, etc., occupy bulk of the financial flows. But increasing physical risks over the year, physical climate risks over the years, has resulted in code red for humanity. So in this context, adaptation finance becomes important. And that is not just important from a risk standpoint, but also looking at it from an opportunity standpoint. And when I say adaptation finance, that again, it lacks a clear definition, But it is going, beyond business as usual and incorporating the possible effects of climate change into the design of an activity. Now, while adaptation finance is very important, and the recent COP spoke about adaptation in a big way, the annual adaptation gap, the finance gap is about $163.40 billion, by 2030. And emerging markets, as you all know, more vulnerable, more, impacted more by climate change. So that becomes an extra, impetus towards adaptation finance for these, geographies. Maybe I'll talk a little more about it later. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. I think that quite nicely explains the nuanced difference between the terms, and I think our audience must have been benefited. So yeah, so I think you hit the tone of the discussion very rightly, and we all know that planet Earth is bleeding. The good news is that people have now sat up and started taking notice that how we can cure it. But this process of curing, particularly for the emerging economies, is going to be very, very expensive. You all know that. And this is where you talked about the gap, adaptation gap, that is to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars that is there. So in this backdrop, I would now like to ask Annie. So Annie, this, as Smita has already defined climate finance. So I think all investment which is going into creating a net zero economy, thereby meaning net zero carbon emissions. But are there any other dimensions to climate finance, which I think some of them Smita alluded to? What are other dimensions in your opinion, Annie? Over to you.
I think Smita laid it out very clearly. I think, Pankaj, there is a very narrow dimension, which is what has been discussed, say, in Egypt right now in COP, what is inside the UNFCCC discussion of finance. Finance was a very important topic of discussion. That, I think, is the narrow discussion about, and I'll come to that. But Smita also made a very important point. There's also a very wide discussion, because this transition that we all are facing is not just an energy transition we need to do. It's an economic transition of how the economy will work, what will be value, what will be price. Take India, for example. India is not about the energy transition. India would have to go through a really significant agriculture transition. 50% of India's agriculture is people are employed. Employment is in agriculture. It's only 14% of GDP, but you can't get to 1.5 degree in India without. So one simple point I'm making is the widest sense of climate finance. My own judgment in the near future, it will be finance, because we would find it very hard to qualify. Is this bridge building climate related, or we needed the bridge anyway? The answer is both. Right? We needed the bridge anyway, and we need to make it resilient to future changes in climate. Or at this healthcare facility we are building, shall we make sure they take care of heat-related distresses? There will be all these things will be connected. So there's a very wider discussion. But I think the narrow discussion is equally important of the COP, simply because that's the only place poorer and vulnerable countries have a voice to shape that discussion. So how $110 trillion of private capital gets shaped in the world, the poorer countries really don't have a voice in that. It does get shaped. That's the biggest amount of money that there is in the world. But this narrow one is important because it's a signal. So for example, in the narrow one part of the UNFCCC climate discussion, I just want to point out three things. One was in 2009, rich countries agreed to fund poorer countries for both adaptation and mitigation. $100 billion by 2020. This comes up all the time simply because this $100 billion has not been met yet. It's about $83 million right now per year. To be fair, this $100 billion is actually a very small amount of money compared to what's needed for the transition, but symbolically, it's a very important one. This year, last week, not 2 weeks back, it's a blur to me. Last week, it was agreed to set up a loss and damage fund, which is a very significant move for UNF. This has been a 30-year long. That would be another very UNFCCC fund. And the Green Climate Fund that was set up about 10 years back, which is by UNFCCC, that actually gathers and disburses loans and grants for climate relief. So the narrow one is important for many reasons, but really going forward, Pankaj, we will be talking about finance. I think we will be talking less about climate finance.
Okay, amazing. So I think as a student of finance, what my learning is that all finance is likely to become climate finance, and climate finance will become the mainstream finance maybe 20, 30 years down the line. And that perhaps will be a great development and very interesting one at that.
I think, Pankaj, I think we just have to incorporate climate related risks and opportunities in financial decisions we take, as we do today for other risks and opportunities. We just have to mainstream it in our decision making.
Yes, and that's a very important point. So incorporating climate related issues into the current financial models. So let's talk about the international financial institutions, which largely came into existence for development purposes after the World War II. So do you think that new models will be required to handle the issues which are more systemic in nature, more communal in nature, and and they are developing concurrently and also reinforcing each other due to climate changes? So do you think that the established financial paradigms also will undergo a major shift, although we see some efforts like central banks in various countries are incorporating or at least nudging the regulated entities to incorporate these risks into their assessment procedure, their portfolio, carbon footprints, etc. So do you think there will be a complete change in the financial paradigm as it exists today?
This is a question for whom, Pankaj?
This is for you, Annie. This is a follow-up, and I would like Smita also to share her thoughts because she has extensively worked on sustainable finance. So maybe briefly, you
I'm
can
happy to go first. Love to hear Smita's views on this.
Okay.
I think there are three kinds of answers to this. One is the overall financial markets, and one of the indicators is, say, Commodity Futures Trading Commission or the central banks. Actually, the Commodities Futures FTC has already incorporated climate in their guidance. So we actually work with them. I think 80 plus, 85 or something central banks have incorporated climate related issues. Not all, but 85 is actually a pretty big number given there's about 200 countries in the world, a lot of the large. So we see already from the bigger financial regulators in the world, this is because simply it's a risk. People who run finance are very clear about what the risk is and what they need. It's a risk on the investments they're making, risk about hard assets that might get ruined by climate, or risk about stranded assets in the future that they're investing on, right? So there are many kinds of risks to think about. I personally see a positive movement from regulators. I also see positive movement from fund managers to think about incorporating this. So that's one way to think about it. I'd love to hear Smita's view on this. My view is a lot more needs to be done, but I see a positive movement from that. The second question you asked about the financial model. Obviously, we need a different financial model because right now our financial model doesn't incorporate carbon or nature in an appropriate way that values or prices it, right? So whatever way we do it, whether there'll be carbon pricing as there is some parts of the economy in the world or some other way, we have to figure out how to incentivize nature and protecting of the earth, how to disincentivize destruction of the. Just to be clear, right now, the reason we are in the stage of 1.2 degree heat is that we are unable to signal from pricing them in the system. So yes, the question is, what will it be? I think this is a big $1,000 question or $1 million question, but there's a lot of discussion going on this. How does one change our financial system so the right incentives and right signals are there? And there are many different things going on. For example, the United States, the regulator that manages all the stocks, manages everything that is listed in the stock market. They're considering right now, there's a proposal floated in the public now that every company that is in the stock market, which is an enormous part of the economy, would have to list scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's a huge shift if that goes through. I'm doubtful it'll go through, but some form it'll go through. So that's one thing to think about, and I'm sure Smita will have. The other thing you asked about the international financial institutions. As you noted, I personally worked at the World Bank for about 20 years. And there is actually a big issue that's very much in the mind of people of the reform of these organizations, for two reasons, I think. One, the amount of funds needed for this transition is enormous compared to the capacity of this organization right now. These organizations combined are capable of disbursing at the level of a couple of $100 billion a year. Plus, if you add the bilateral flows, it's about $300 billion a year. Most estimate, the most conservative estimates are $1 trillion a year level. So just the size, leveraging of private capital. So there is actually a much more fundamental reform people are thinking about, including people like me. These banks, the world, let me talk about the multilateral banks, were set up after the war for first to reconstruct post-war. So actually the World Bank gave money to Japan. I don't know if you know, bullet trains were funded by Japan by World Bank money many years back. But soon those countries didn't need any money because they did very well. It was about development, building actually raw core infrastructure, roads, bridges, building. But today's development challenge, I think, is different than building just roads. Our examination shows that if you do the transition right, there's a $26 trillion gain for the global economy by 2030. So the new economic paradigm is how to manage and reap benefit. Smith already mentioned of renewable energy, electric car vehicles. So these institutions that were set up for development needs to shift gear about how the development paradigm is. And that is a much harder and a difficult step that needs to be taken. And I personally think there's a lot of momentum for it.
Great. I think that was wonderful. And Smita, so what is your take? You have been working in the area of sustainable finance and ESG.
Yeah.
So he mentioned
Yeah,
about.
so I think, I think Ani has covered pretty much everything, all facets of it. A couple of things. So yes, definitely banks are changing their the way of looking at it, but a long way to go. Still a long way to go. But a couple of angles here I want to bring in. One is on the whole, capital providers angle. So from an investor standpoint, and given the climate developments which are happening in Europe, a little bit in US right now, and home to all the major owners of capital globally, there is a chance, or rather it's already happening, that this will just translate to emerging economies, right? So banks who are getting funded by these investors will have to look at these aspects. The second is on the regulations angle itself. So again, a regulator-led approach. So for example, in India, the RBI came out recently with the climate risks discussion paper. So this speaks about various facets of climate risks, from strategy to risk management, disclosures to governance. So such action, by regulators will force the banking sector to look at climate risks more deeply. So both from a regulatory policy angle, as well as from an investor angle, this push is coming through. And another angle which one needs to be very cognizant about is the entire disclosure space. The greenwashing, which we all hear about, is actually real. So how does one kind of navigate this and put out your business models in such a way that there is no greenwashing? So that is key actually to kind of draw in finance flows.
So you have referred to greenwashing, which is unfortunately a sad truth. And I think, not just blaming the promoters or the issuers of green bonds, which may be doing greenwashing. I think one reason is lack of a universally accepted taxonomy on what green bonds are, what they do, for what purpose they can be used. I think European Union came up with some standards recently, but it is yet to be accepted globally. I think that's a very valid point. So we often hear only about green bonds when it comes to issuing financial instruments which are in the ambit of sustainable finance. Now, I would like to know in your practice, do you foresee that, especially in the emerging markets, do you foresee that some more innovation in financial instruments will be coming up? For example, there could be an ESG-based ETF, and we now in India at least have number of ESG mutual funds also. So what other innovations do you see which can help emerging markets in raising finance for green initiatives?
This is for me.
Yes, Smita, because I think your
Sure.
green bonds actually triggered me to ask this question.
Okay. No, so I think absolutely. I think innovating on the financing side is extremely crucial, given that there is only that much that traditional means of financing can do right now. Countries are putting out net zero targets, and while the country level commitments and targets are encouraging, and that's just going to translate to financial level targets, bank level targets, etc. But like Ani was pointing out, the gap between what is needed and what is actually there in terms of financing is huge. And that would just not be satisfied by one form of financing, right? So there is a need to innovate. And I want to just quickly touch upon 2 or 3 products. One is, of course, the green bonds you spoke about, which is increasingly becoming popular, mainly to finance green projects, green assets, green business activities which have an environmental benefit. And that can be issued by banks, corporates, governments. So governments are coming out with sovereign bond issuances. And such bond issuances, when certified by a verified independent verifier, say like a climate bonds initiative, that kind of avoids the risk of greenwashing to a large extent. And green bond frameworks have come up mainly on the line of ICMA principles to kind of build the veracity of the whole offering, right? So what are the use of proceeds? What are the how are they going to be managed? Where will they be deployed? How will the impact get reported? These kind of aspects. So green bonds, GSS bonds, that's one. The next is, and it's increasingly getting popular, is outcome-based financing. And this is basically, driving substantial, results and incentives based on achieving favorable outcomes, So just to describe the structure, an investor puts in money and for a service provider who will in turn, deliver the intervention required to bring about the change. And then there are either philanthropies or multilateral agencies which come in as outcome funders to kind of, so the service provider gets that return, as well as the risk investor is compensated. So something like a development impact bond can be a good example for this. Sustainability linked loans. So that's another innovation, where the KPIs are defined beforehand, and depending on achieving those KPIs, the interest rate comes down for the issuer. Pay-as-you-go models are also kind of getting very popular across the world, mainly for, like there's an MCOPA, Azuri solar technology. Those are some examples, funding small solar interventions. And finally, I think where we see more and more innovations coming across is the blended finance model. So that is basically looking at catalyzing capital from, using public monies, how private capital can be catalyzed. So in fact, Dr. CSG worked on some similar blended finance model in Zimbabwe, for renewable energy. So I think there are a lot of different models, innovations, structures, which are kind of coming up. And with the right combination of policies and incentives built into the structures, these can take off.
All right, great.
Pankaj, can I add a sentence to what?
Yes, please. I was about to ask you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Smita laid out really nicely all the various financial instruments there are, and many getting invented. I just want to refer to the bigger problem here, where these innovations are very much needed. Right now, the current architecture there is of financing transitions in the global south. The global north, I think transition financing is United States today. If you wanted to put up a renewable energy, there's more money than you can imagine. Money is chasing projects in the United States today. That's where we are in financing. Maybe right now with interest rates changing is slightly tighter, but it was someone is raising the question is actually the money flowing to global south or emerging economies. So last year, about $294 billion was spent on renewable energy. Majority of them went to global north. Africa got 4% of it, which has the highest solar capacity in the world. So this is where we are, right? That one is the money is not flowing to global south from private capital at the scale that is needed. And the second fact is that without private capital flowing, the public capital is not enough for the transition. Both things are true. So the question is, how do you get private capital to the places you need is exactly what Smita pointed out, is various kind of innovation that simply actually the overall goal is de-risking private capital in whichever way one. So bond is one way to de-risk it, where the private capital doesn't take any risk except the bondholders' risk. But there are many ways, right? You can blend it, as Smita talked about, or first loss, like the bank is doing right now. There are many ways, but the bigger point here is how do you de-risk it? And one of the things I want to add to Smita's list is actually helping countries building capacity and changing policies. So capital investments is more predictable, long-term contracts are more enforceable, which is the biggest risk we face in a lot of places, because a lot of these transactions are long-term capital, long-term transactions. So that's where the crux is, and there's no silver bullet. It is actually years of working together. India, I must point out, as Smita talked about, is an enviable place because there is actually a lot of venture capital in India compared to any of country at the similar income level, like any country in the similar. So India actually has a very active investment market. Not yet for all the things we're talking about, but very active in general that can transition into. So it's a very exciting space right now, but I just want to point out that it's not enough money is flowing to global south. I mean, we can't, because there is so much excitement going on, we shouldn't assume this is anywhere near solved.
Yeah, of course. I think just before COP27, a report came which projected the demand for transition money to the tune of $2.4 trillion by 2030. If the emerging economies ex-China wanted to become net zero, and current spend is to the tune of $500 billion. So you can see the 4800x gap between the aspiration, and we have only 8 years to go for this decade to end. So that is the kind of gap. But as Annie, I was intrigued by a remark you made that countries like India, which have very active investment market. Now, this is where my concern lies. So, you must be aware that in India, the stock markets are very, very active, but bond markets are just a fraction of them. And in the space of sustainable finance, it is bonds which are ruling the roost, as you rightly pointed out, that there's only bondholders' risk, and otherwise the investors is de-risked. So the risk capital will take a very, very long time before it starts getting into these markets. So my question is, I think this is the scenario with most of the emerging economies. So do you think that the kind of, the extent of financing that transition requires, and with the state of development of bond markets in these institutions, so right now we are seeing a bubble, but I think we have boundary conditions well laid out, and beyond that, it has to be a resort to either multilateral financing institutions or some other kind of financing, as Smita pointed out, outcome-based financing, etc., etc. Do you think green financing itself is sustainable because it is based on bonds? I mean, to be specific, green bonds itself, given the state of development of bond markets in emerging economies?
This is actually, Smita should answer this question for India. I think bonds have a place in this architecture. I absolutely want to encourage our listeners to think about the whole spectrum of options that's available for innovation and financial flow. Bond is one of the vehicles. It is not the only vehicle. Bond actually requires a significant institutional capacity to issue bonds and manage bonds. And every country has different. India actually has been doing this for a while. This is not every country can't do what India does, and India also has its own limitation in the bond market. But it's an important vehicle But remember, the risk in the bond market is taken by the risk issuer. So ultimately, if you want private capital to flow and scale, you want the private investor to assume some of the risk. Otherwise, sovereigns will be left with holding the risk all the time. And that is not a sustainable scaling model. So somewhere in the path of this growth, we have to figure out how an investor sitting, say, in Denmark actually is taking some of the risk of a offshore project. And all the risk is not just sitting with the sovereign. Then, that's the limitation. How much risk can a sovereign carry? So to mature this market, Pankaj, my view is that you cannot just depend on the bond issuance. First of all, it is too slow for it to get scale. Second, the risk doesn't get distributed. Ultimately, you want a functioning market. So I actually think the blended issues that Smita talked about, first loss issues, Smita talked, which has some sharing of risk so that the investor gets comfortable in investing and getting returns. This is what you want, right? This is all money-making propositions, renewable energy storage, all these are not, we are not asking people for investment that has no return. There are investments that have low returns, a lot of public investment like that. We want to save that for the public part of the investment. The government should, but the part of the investment that had to return, we want to figure out how private capital not only can invest, can get returns. Maybe not 14% return that the American investors are comfortable with, but some return, So that's my view. I think what my view would be, and I'm not an expert in this, Smita is that we have to use the whole spectrum of options, and we have to figure out how we have an adult conversation of risk, and not what I hear from private investors now in the global north. They want all the risk to be taken away. It's someone else's business. I mean, that's not a serious conversation. So that's my view, Pankaj.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, Ani. So one needs to look at the different, the entire spectrum of options, right from equity being the riskiest of the lot, down to the safest bet. But I think one point I wanted to, kind of link, because we're talking of bonds here, is the presence of a taxonomy, for a country at a country level. And I know the EU has come out with the taxonomy. China has come out with one. There are country level taxonomies. But I think what will give a lot of comfort to the private investors is when there is a clear definition, or at least what is green and what is not. And for a country to come out and say that, I want to have this private capital from the global north, I think that amount of comfort is required, at least at a country level, to say that these can be green and this cannot be green, right? So that is one angle. But having said that, yes, it is very important for the sovereign not to take the risk and to share the risk with the private investor world. And that's how I think there will be scale as well, because there is only that much that public money can do. And while there is a lot of money sitting within foundations, within the private institutions, how does one kind of attract that money into the country? Would be to have these enabling policy mechanisms in place.
So Pankaj, I just want to add one thing to what Smita said. One of the things we've been working on is actually exactly what Smita said, is to help countries develop a financing strategy, not what to finance, but how to finance. So think about, so countries have NDCs, which is their commitment to climate, reduction of, which is a commitment. That's not a plan. It's just a commitment to do X, Y, Z. That needs to be converted to an investment plan, right? We're going to do this year, that next year. We're going to focus on energy this year. We're going to focus on transmission next year, whatever the plan is. Our view is that after you do this, or when you do this, you need to actually have a separate capability of how do you finance it. That includes public capital, private capital, philanthropic capital. And our view is that capability is that we are ignoring investing in it. That capacity with the finance, most of the time actually with the finance ministry. How do you manage this risk? How do you measure them? What taxonomy do you have? How do you do? We did a couple of initiatives, for example, relatively small country in Fiji to have their first financing strategy, which has reaps huge, because then those countries can figure out, okay, what options do I have? How do I use my scarce public capital for X, and how do I leverage Y? We have done this in Colombia. Our view is it'll be a hugely positive and a very small investment to actually help all these countries to have a much more sophisticated financing strategy for how to finance these things, so they can leverage, as Smita was pointing out, all the options that are available to them even today. More options are needed, but even today, there are actually quite a few options.
All right. I think that was a great insight, Annie, that you're helping governments to devise plans how to raise that finance. I think that's amazing. And I believe that it's an iterative process, and this is getting, developed by every new assignment. Now, now let me transition all of us from how to raise finance to how to use that finance. So now comes the question of end use of the green money, right? And again, just like there is an absence of consensus on the costs which are associated with climate change, I think there's a lot of debate about, which are the heads under which this money needs to be spent, and a lot of judgment about how much money is required. A lot of different assessments keep coming up. So now my question is that, do you think that, as you talked about the finance strategies, so do you think that these issues, the end use of the green money, that also is going to impact the strategies which are required for raising climate finance?
Sorry, is this for Smita or me?
Yeah, it is for you, Annie.
Okay. So that's exactly, Pankaj, the point I was making. So, well, that countries need to prioritize what they want to invest in, right? That is what the end use is, whether it is for protecting if you look at climate related, one is the mitigation part. So let me talk, we have talked a lot about mitigation. Let me talk about adaptation for a minute. There's a lot of climate related impact that's taking place right now. So Bangladesh, for example, a study showed the households in Bangladesh today are paying $2 billion a year of cost borne by the household. Imagine that number for a second. Pakistan just had a $30 billion disaster on flooding. So $30 billion in Pakistan's economy is not just a weather incident. It actually impacts the whole economy. The GDP numbers are different next year for that. So these are the kind of things that are happening in the world today. So the question is, the governments have to absolutely think about what they want to invest in. What is their priority? Is it, and most of the climate related things, not most of them are water related, meaning too much water, too little water, bad in Africa, they're in Kenya right now, the parts of land that's not cultivable anymore. So what do? Do you relocate? Do you train them? Parts of Fiji, they had to relocate whole villages from one part of the island to another. Who pays for those things? So the question is, that is what a climate investment strategy is. As you think about it, this basically what the development strategy is, right? What a country's development strategy will look like and take climate related risks in it. So that is what the investment part of what they should do about how should the, my own views, every country in the world will have this so much need. I mean, IPCC just pointed out in a report earlier this year, I think, that by 2030, it'll be $500 billion of physical loss. As I pointed out to you earlier, the overall transfer that takes place between richer MDBs and multi-bilateral is about $300 billion. So this is bigger than all the transfer that takes place in the public sector between rich countries and poor countries or the banks. So everywhere it'll be finite resources. So the question is, how best do you use your finite resources, and how do you leverage other capital? So this planning that the countries, the finance ministries have to do, or the planning department in India's case, Niti Aayog, I'm sure plays a very important role with the finance ministry. In the work we did in Indonesia, we worked with Bappenas, which is the planning ministry, to do some of these modeling and planning to prioritize investment. I absolutely feel these prioritization that countries are working on would be critical for them to figure out where to put the money and where to leverage capital from other places.
Can I add a point here?
Yes, Smita,
So
please.
just to add to what Annie was saying, so emerging economies of the global south had a different kind of, dilemma, I should say, not dilemma. So when we talk of green, we always talk of climate and we talk of, mitigation and things like that. But there's a very huge social angle which Annie brought about, which is a priority. And taxonomies, for example, the EU taxonomy doesn't talk of social right now. But when a country like India brings out a taxonomy, there should be a social angle. And I think there is, which is in the works, which is very critical, when you look at it from an entire, a just transition perspective. So when an economy is transitioning out of coal, for example, there are millions of workers there who are going to be affected. So how does the money which actually goes into greening a brown project, for example, actually look at both, not just the green aspects, but also the social aspects? So that becomes very important for countries in the emerging countries.
And we have been very, on that, Smita, we work very closely with the South Africa Energy Transition Commission set up by the president. And that's, I think, one of the best examples I've seen in the emerging economy, where they've taken this transition. And, we talk about how so many jobs will be created by renewables. It turns out these jobs are in different places. So if a family in Bihar that might lose a job in the coal mine is not able to travel to another part of the country where the jobs are. So we have to be very specific of what we're talking about, which family we're talking about, what transition we're talking. And South Africa, and I give a lot of credit to the labor movement, which is very much part of this conversation, actually have focused on, okay, which area are we talking about? What job? What training do they need? What is the new kind of job? How can they be trained for the new, the renewable industry? And that specificity. And this takes, as you know, a lot of resources and time, and it just, you can't just wish it away. And I've been impressed with what they're trying to do. I hope Indonesia, which is the next in line, actually, we are really hoping that there's a lot of knowledge transfer and capacity transfer between the two places.
Okay, I believe that you hit it just on the head when you talked about what is called labor force transition and how to fund that. Now, I was just wondering that given the specific requirements of emerging economies, especially in the context of the social impact of climate issues or climate events, I think in order to understand these issues better, these economies themselves need to invest in research and studies which can figure out precisely what is required where. So the question is that research and development as it is have hardly been a priority. I mean, they did not have enough money left for investing in research and development. And that was the rich guys club which used to do it. How do you think, I think I would start with Smita on that. Smita, how do you think that R&D can promote? You have been researching and published also on ESG issues. So what's your take on that? How research on these issues can be funded in emerging economies?
See, I think innovations are absolutely critical, when it comes to any area, more so for climate change. And when we look at financing technologies, there are two parts to it, I would say. One is financing the transition itself, so moving away from, say, petrol and diesel run automobiles to EVs. And the second part is financing the supply chain. So while there are two components, the challenges for both more or less remain the same. So innovation in finance is just as much necessary as it is in technology. And given that traditional financing models do not actually provide that many incentives, say for EVs or purchase of its components, new modes of, new models of financing and structures need to be brought in. For example, leasing models, which have been used in renewable energy and energy efficiencies. These are useful for, market expansion, and such models can actually be a central component for, financing EV supply chains, so to say. And so there was an example that I read about recently on the electric bus market in Taiwan, wherein the model used was, the concept of green finance to finance electric bus operations in the country. And it was a very nice tie-in of three entities, the government, there was an alliance consisting of manufacturers and the service operator. And the model was such that, the profits accumulated by the bus operators in a year are substantial enough to kind of, cover the costs. So scalable and replicable models, will enable investment in, research and stimulate innovation to finance the energy transition path. Yeah.
All right. I think in India also we have a company which is Energy Efficiency Services Limited, public sector undertaking, which
Yes.
operates on the leasing model, and they have been highly successful, especially since the cost per unit of renewable energy is coming down. So I think that was a great example, and thank you for that. I think I have too many questions to ask you. You have stimulated a lot of questions in me, but in the interest of time, I think now I should invite some questions from our audience. So Paul, if you're there, can you help me with that? Are there any questions from our audience?
Yes, I'm here. Currently, no, we've not received any question yet from the audience, and I think we have about 10 or so minutes to also end the session or less. So maybe you can wrap it up if there are no questions from the audience yet.
Okay, so in such cases, I would like to believe that we have left the audience speechless. That was on a lighter note. So I think it was a wonderful discussion, and I had the privilege of talking to two great minds on this area, climate finance and sustainability. And I will make a humble attempt to summarize, though it is a very, very challenging job, because the kind of aspects that were covered, I think I was making their lives difficult by asking questions and asking them to be short. Now I did not realize that in the end I'll have to do the honors myself.
We have so much to speak, there's no time.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, and I think we can save it for another day. So I think the panel talked about, they started off with the ambition gap that is there, and how this is leading to a change in paradigms all across, especially in terms of financing. And I think some of the new avenues mentioned were based outcome-based financing and pay-as-you-go model. And then in the context of innovative financial instruments, I mean, the risk can never be zero. So some risk has to be taken either in the form of bond investing or any other form of investing. And there are strategies like World Resources Institute, bodies like them are, trying to educate governments about them and creating strategies. So there are options, and that whole spectrum needs to be explored. And, ultimately it's the poor who are in the emerging economy context who are, bearing this burden, and the transition of labor force is another pertinent issue that needs to be looked at. And, perhaps the pressing need is that the taxonomy that emerging economies need to utilize for green financing or climate financing should not be just a copy of what EUs and others are doing. I mean, they need to have take into account the social angle in the development of the taxonomy. So I think this was essentially what we talked about. Amongst other things, I'm sure I might have missed out a couple of insights which our esteemed panelists offered, because there was so much to learn from. So any final remarks, Annie, quickly, and then
First
Smita?
of all, congratulations for an excellent summary.
Thank you.
And my only remark is, I think Smita said this, I think a lot more focus need to be put on the question of financing, not what to finance, but how to finance. Because too much of our energy goes on innovation, technology, all those exciting things. But I am personally very concerned if we do not have a much different path of and a much different volume of finance. We can have more ambitious NDCs. Nothing will happen because we won't be able to finance them. So I like first of all, I want to thank Paul and others to have a discussion on financing. And as Smita pointed out, much innovation is needed in this space. The current models are not enough. Absolutely not enough. So I look for, we have committed ourselves to actually work full-fledged on this, but much more of this conversation needed. So I very welcome, Pankaj, you encouraging us to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Smita, your final words?
Yeah. So I think you've summarized very beautifully, Pankaj. I think one aspect we didn't speak about and which came to my mind when you were summarizing was on capacities and how capacities within financial institutions, within companies, borrowers are required to kind of understand the whole space. So we did a landscape analysis last year, I think, with Indian banks, and what we found was awareness on ESG and climate issues was very minimal, and incorporating them into their lending practices was almost negligible. And I think similar results were found in across different emerging markets, a couple of other emerging markets we found. So I think upping that capacity skills within financial institutions is extremely important for them to understand the gravity of the issue and also put in innovations to look at opportunities, not just the risk side, but also opportunities around the whole climate change space. Thank you very much for having me over.
Yeah, thank you, Smita, and thank you, Annie. I cannot thank you enough for sparing your valuable times and, more importantly, sparing your valuable thoughts for the benefit of the audience and for us. I learned a lot from the discussion, and I'm sure the audience must have been mesmerized by the kind of range that you two covered, and of course, the very important messages that you passed across. And I think it will go a long way in shaping their thinking on climate finance. So thank you, both of you, and we look forward to having you in our midst sometime again. So I think, Paul, it's over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Pankaj. Gentlemen and lady, we so much appreciate your time and your insight that you've shared with us to actually climax our day one of the Global Economic Ideas Festival. So this is the second conversation that we had on climate change today. And it's all fed into even the first session that we have with Pierre Jacket of the Global Development Network. So we so much appreciate the insight you shared. This session, has been recorded, of course. We'll make it available on our YouTube platform and shared as well to be promoted and across other platforms as well. So we are very much grateful. Those that join us, we say thank you. Our day 2 begins tomorrow at 9 a.m. Central European time. We have 3 sessions. We're beginning with a very fireside chats on China. Today we had a session on India. Tomorrow we have it on China because, as I said earlier, in the GEIF, our main focus has been on the emerging markets. And of course, we have our 2 big markets in India and China. So tomorrow we're having a special session on China to begin the sessions. And of course, we have other 2 plenary sessions, one on technology and another one on global trade. So until we come here again tomorrow, we say a big thank you to you for our speakers and of course, for all of you for joining this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice. Let's go.